As of late, I've seen a fair amount of posts from the perspective of criminals. These posts have inspired me to share a story about a scary incident I had as a kid and how I became a better man because of it. I realize I'm a tad bit older than most of the members here on Reddit, so I wanted to use my experience to show this younger breed of criminals that it's never too late to turn your life around. Pay close attention, please. Between 10 and 16, I spent more time inside of juvie than I did in school. I'd been born into a world of petty crime. All of those around me, including my own townsfolk, had been in the penitentiary at least once, and I never really had known any other life. My friends and I had a little gang we called the Breakers. As you can probably tell from the name, we specialized in burglary, and we thought we were the princes of crime. Stupid and cringeworthy when you look back on it, but no one dared challenge the idea. Depending on the location and the size of the job, we often worked in 2 or 3 man teams. On one break-in in particular, we had received information from a girl we knew very well that a family was going to be out of town for the weekend. From what the couple had told her, the husband was, and had been for a long time, a rabid gun collector. Now, any crook you talk to can tell you guns are a good source of quick cash. So, we did a short casing of the place and chose that weekend for the robbery. Unfortunately, the other 2 guys I was planning to work with got really sick, and I was left alone to get as much as I could in the amount of time we had allotted for the job. I'd even considered going in a second night in a row, but circumstances you will soon see put the kibosh on that idea. 2 nights later, the moment had arrived to go in. I slipped in through the back sliding door, and the steady rainstorm that evening kept a nosy neighbor inside. The only thing I didn't know was the location of the guns. I figured a guy that's serious about firearms would have at least one safe, so I kept my eyes open for one. One by one, I rummaged through each room I came to. No doors were closed, making it all the easier. Frankly, I was surprised at the lack of any real valuables and focused on the search for guns. Finally, I discovered an upright safe, and to my great joy, found that it was unlocked. I was counting the money in my head, but that was as far as I'd ever get. To my right, in the hallway, I heard a sound no burglar hopes to ever hear: the racking of a shotgun. I froze the second I realized what it was. Now, I was counting my last few seconds alive rather than money. The racking was quickly followed by an older gentleman's voice saying, "Stop right there, kid. If you move, I will kill you." I had no doubt he would have too. "Look at me, son. I'm going to give you one chance. Someone did the same for me once, and I'm doing the same for you. However, if I see you again in this house uninvited, you're not leaving alive." I wasn't sure whether I was more terrified or shocked by what he said. As I stared into his weathered eyes, I got the feeling that he'd seen his share of hard times as a kid and may have been in the exact position I was now at one point. "Do you understand me?" His words were crystal clear. The overwhelming feeling I was being given an opportunity many in my trade were not given poured over me. I simply nodded at him, but was still too terrified to move, and he had to urge me to leave. "Well, get." That was all I needed. I ran as fast as possible out of the house and to my car down the block. The fear that he was about to shoot me in the back was there the entire time, but I had to take the chance. While I sat there in my car, I juggled the importance of the scene around in my head. I had just been handed a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity most would not have been given. I feared that if I squandered it, my punishment for doing so may be terrible. Although I'd never been a religious kid, and still ain't for that matter, I knew some higher power had to have just stepped in and handed my life back to me. I've never questioned who he was or what he was doing there. From that night forward, I resolved to change my life for the better. To be honest with you, it was a hard path to follow. When you know nothing other than doing bad, doing good is twice as hard. Those around me were in no way happy to hear of my epiphany, and I got a lot of grief for it. I eventually realized that I was never going to achieve what I wanted to if I stayed where I was, so I took the little bit of cash I had saved and moved on. I drove halfway across the country looking for a place I liked and finally landed in Colorado. The utter beauty of the place was unlike anywhere I'd seen, and I've been here ever since. While I never became a wealthy man, I did find a legit way to make money and hope to retire in the next 10 years. If anyone is wondering why I'm sharing this, it's not because I want people to think I'm some great guy for turning my back on crime. Actually, a lot of great fellows I knew were crooks, but most were lowlifes that wasted their lives in jail. My real purpose is to impress upon the younger members of life that you can change it for the better. Your past and your upbringing don't dictate your future, and not every square citizen has written you off. If you want to turn your life around, do it, and if someone offers you a lifeline, take it. You'll not regret it. Good luck to you all, and don't be afraid to believe in yourself. I believe I was 9 years old at the time. My little brother had just been born, and since my folks already had their hands full with him, I was shipped off to my grandparents' place for spring break. I guess my aunt and uncle were so in love with that idea they sent my 2 cousins to them also. I can't say I was overjoyed to see them there when I arrived. They'd always been spoiled and their behavior showed it. However, I was a good little girl, so I did what I was told and played nicely with them. My grandparents were living in a small town in the north of Louisiana at the time. Most of the lots around them were empty because of a past tornado, so the house was somewhat isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. We didn't mind. It gave us plenty of room to play baseball and run around unhindered. One of my cousin's birthdays had occurred a week before, and he had received a kite as a gift. That day we spent flying it around and fighting over who got to hold the string. After supper, our grandmother pulled out the Monopoly board and taught us how to play. The game greatly appealed to my cousins, and they did all they could, whether within the rules or not, to accumulate more money than anyone else. I quickly grew tired of this and snuck off to our bedroom to read my new book. The first Harry Potter had just come out the year before, and my parents had bought it for me for Christmas. I must have fallen asleep reading and was awakened by my cousins coming into the room for the night. It wasn't long until I was back asleep, but something else would wake me up soon after. If I recall correctly, about 2:15 that morning, a loud banging sound woke me up. The banging was coming from the front door, it turned out. My grandfather peeked out of his window and saw a pair of guys in hoods smashing themselves against the door. It wasn't until much later in life I learned that a group of men with which these were associated with had been committing home invasions in the area, and my grandparents were their targets that night. The banging had also awakened my cousins, and although they were a few years older than me, they were crying in fear. I'm not going to be arrogant and claim that I wasn't just as afraid as them, and I've never seen the point in crying about it. I suppose I could have been considered a tomboy back then, and maybe I was just trying to look tough. Anyhow, unaware of what was going on at the time, I went out into the hall to find out from my grandfather. He and my grandmother were talking quietly to each other. Rather than answer my question, he told me to go back into my room and close the door. I noticed that he was holding a shotgun when he said this, and the look on his face was very serious. I did what he said and locked the door behind me just to be safe. Now I was really beginning to get scared. I'd never seen him with a gun before that night. I knew he owned them, but I was still a little too young to shoot, so they were kept locked up. I was sitting with my cousins, doing my best to keep them calm. This entire time the banging was still going on, and it was becoming even more unsettling. Then I heard my grandfather yell out that he had a gun, and he would shoot if they didn't go away. They, unfortunately, continued, and right after, I heard a loud crunching noise in the hall, quickly followed by 2 shots. The house went completely silent for a moment, minus the quiet sobbing of my cousins. Not long after, I could see the lights from police cars coming through the curtains. The voices of different adults could be heard through the door. I didn't remember anything specific, but Sometime around dawn, my grandmother knocked on the door and I let her in. She was there to let us know everything was okay and we could come out if we wanted to. She cooked everyone breakfast, and as we ate, nobody said much. From my seat at the table, I could see the front door. It had the 2 giant holes in it, and the edge was splintered and broken. The screen door was the only thing stopping the wind from blowing in. I tried to stay awake for a while, but was forced to take a nap after lunch. I woke up a few hours later to a brand new door and life as usual. My folks were as upset as you'd expect and came and got me that evening. I was happy to get away from my snotty cousins and was eager to meet my new little brother anyway. It took some time before we could stay the night there again, and for the reminder of their time on Earth, I can't remember that night ever being spoken of by either of them. I had to get most of my legal information from my parents, and what they said was my grandfather had killed one of the intruders the second the door gave way. The other got away, but was picked up by the cops later that morning at the ER getting his wounds treated. That guy was still in prison, the last I heard, probably on another unrelated crime. The best thing that came out of the incident was the ending of the home invasions in the area. No charges were ever filed against my grandfather for the shooting. There was briefly talk about the family of the dead guy suing my grandparents, but once it was determined that 2 old people living on Social Security had nothing to get, the suit quietly faded away. As a child, any situation involving a group of adults trying to harm them or being perceived to harm them can be terrifying. I was about 13 when I had an encounter with a pair of men attempting to break into our home. While I can in no way prove they meant me any harm that day, I was nonetheless scared out of my mind while it was happening. I had been forced to stay home from school that day because of the flu and had slept most of the morning. The chills, among other far more terrible symptoms, had yet to subside, but I hadn't eaten anything for almost 24 hours at this point and couldn't avoid it any longer. From experience, I knew the only thing I could usually keep down when sick were saltines. I was down in the kitchen rummaging through the cabinets when I heard a loud bang at the front door. Not knowing what had caused it, I ran to the front hallway just in time to hear it again. I sprinted into the room next to the door and looked out the window. When I did, I had a clear view of 2 men standing directly in front of it. It wasn't 10 seconds later that I witnessed one of them kick it. I'd barely had enough time to process the threat and become scared before the man kicked the door, driving me into a whole new level of terrified. There was a phone on the desk next to me and I called 911 for help. I could only imagine how hard it was to speak to me at that moment, yelling every bit of information I could, as quickly as I could. Another bang came soon after. Why that door held up so well, I have no idea. As far as I know, it was your run-of-the-mill door. Certainly nothing special, but it held long enough for the cops to show up. I continued to wait on the phone while they were en route to the house. From my viewpoint, I got to watch the 2 a-holes run for their lives when they saw the police pull up. Even though I was terrified and felt horrible, for that brief moment I was able to laugh at them getting their comeuppance. They scattered and were pursued. However, another group of 3 or 4 officers knocked on the door and identified themselves. I let them in, and once they were sure I was okay, we discussed what had happened. A few remained inside, making sure there were no other people creeping around the property. We hadn't even had the chance to say hello before it came over the radio one of the men had already been caught. The police had to search for about an hour until the other burglar was sniffed out by one of their dogs. Now that they were in custody, I was able to at least attempt getting over the whole mess. I believe because of all the excitement I barfed twice more that day, but a few crackers did manage to calm my stomach somewhat. Yes, I did finally have my saltines, only 4 hours after I first intended. My parents were understandably upset about what happened. They were, however, happy to hear the scumbags were caught. Because they had already quite a long record, both men were sentenced to several years in prison. I was a little shook up by the experience for a few months, but was eventually able to put it behind me. Looking back on it, I'm amazed by how well I handled the situation. After all, I was only just becoming a teenager. Just a few years prior, I had been playing with Barbie dolls. Many of the girls I knew back then who were around my same age probably would have panicked, but for some reason, maybe because I was ill and not thinking straight, I handled myself with grace. I now have far more confidence in my daughter that she may be able to handle a similar situation if one, unfortunately, presents itself. I've been carrying this around on my shoulders for quite some time, and I feel today is the day to tell my story. I will, however, be using a throwaway to tell it. The reasons are many. Among the most important are the legalities behind what I was doing there that night more than what I saw. Before I begin, I want everyone to know that I'm not writing this down to better myself in some way. I'm a criminal. I have been for most of my life and will likely die one. However, as hard as this may be to believe, I do have a conscience, and if I would have been in such a situation, I would like my family to know what really occurred. And because of this, the guilt I've carried around since that night has become a weight far too heavy to bear. With that all out of the way, the time has come to tell the story. For this job, I had made the choice to go in alone. It wasn't a larger home, and the people living there weren't considered wealthy. Word on the street, however, was that the wife had a lot of inherited jewelry. I cased the house for a week and got to know the easiest places to enter undetected. That Saturday night, I sat in the house in hopes they would go out for the evening, and a short time after 7:30 they did just that. I could judge from the way that they were dressed that they were probably going out for dinner in the least. If that was all they had planned, I would still have more than enough time to get in and out. After waiting my customary 5 minutes just to be safe, I slipped around back and into the house. I'd rather not say how I did, but suffice to say it wasn't hard to do. This night I went straight for the bedroom. That's where most folks keep their jewelry, after all. It took a few minutes to locate it, but it proved to be worth it. I'm not a jeweler, so I wasn't sure which piece was real or not. That's the job of a fence. Just by amount, I was likely to have at least a few good things. The rest of the house was next, but before I could get out of the room, I heard the front door open and some people come in. I couldn't tell who it was, but since they were arguing loudly between each other, it was probably the homeowners. Thinking they possibly may have forgotten something and would be leaving again soon after, I hid in the closet. My heart was beating so loud, I'm surprised they couldn't hear. I'd never been in this situation before in my 15 years of doing this, and I was surprised how terrified I was. While I peeked out through the slats on the door, I watched them come into the room yelling and cursing at one another. From what I could gather, the wife had some kind of ailment that caused them to leave the restaurant before they could eat. This meant they were not leaving again, and that meant that I was in some big trouble. I wasn't beyond fighting to get away, but it wasn't something I was looking forward to doing. The argument continued, and the wife stood up and shook her finger in the husband's face over and over. I could tell what was coming before she did, but I didn't expect the outcome. Something about the finger wagging really got to the husband. Can't say I blame him. He reared back and backhanded the wife with all the power he had. She flew back into the dresser behind her, and you could hear the crack as her head smashed into it. She slumped instantly to the floor. I had to stifle my urge to yell out. The panic began to grow across his face, and you could see the gears begin to turn in his head. A new problem had now introduced itself to the situation. If this dude found me in his closet, he'd more than likely try to kill me because I was the only witness. I wasn't a murderer, and I wasn't sure I could kill the guy even if I was in self-defense. I was doing my best to hide my breathing. I was probably as panicked as him, but I continued to watch, getting ready to fight back if caught. I didn't have to, however. An idea popped into his head and a small grin appeared on his face. I don't know what, but whatever it was, needed him to leave the house. I knew this was my chance to get away, and the second I heard the door slam shut, I ran as fast as possible and slipped silently out of the back door. Instead of going out the same way I came in, I hopped the fence and made a big loop around in my car. I tried not to think about what I'd just seen until I got home. There was no way I could call the cops and report it. The question of what I was doing there would most certainly come up. I could make an anonymous tip, but the longer I thought about it, the more I started to feel like a snitch. Maybe that wife was a relentless shrew and made that dude's life unbearable. He clearly had a problem with her finger wagging. However, then I began thinking of her family and the sadness they were going to feel. I had an aunt who died when I was younger, and I watched it tear at my family. The decision to wait and see was made, and it wasn't long before my conscience started weighing on me. I kept hoping I would see a report in the news of the husband turning himself in, but nothing showed up, not even a report of a missing woman. Today makes the 3-month mark, and I've still not heard a blip about it. It's common knowledge of this community's dogged determination to discover the truth behind unsolved crimes and disappearances, so I've come up with an idea. As I said, the knowledge I carry around has become a heavy weight on me. However, since I've been raised that it's wrong to snitch, I see this as the best resolution to my problem. What I'm saying is that I'm passing this on to all of you to investigate. If nothing is discovered, it's probably been handled in some way and is no longer a problem, but if a series of red flags pop up, this might be a chance to solve an important puzzle. I wish everyone good luck, and please know that telling this story has done not only myself a world of good, but others, and I'm thankful for at least you listening. Around this time, I was off work from an injury I had received and had taken up the habit of sleeping all day and stalking the internet at night. I unfortunately had no partner at the time, therefore all my time was my own. Unable to work during that period, I was inventing things to occupy me. One particular boring night, I had decided to clean my closet and sell the things I didn't want to keep. I didn't have many clothes back then, so the organizing part didn't take long. For the next part, I had to bring the clothes I was listing into the living room to measure and take pictures. I'd stacked these on my couch and walked over to my computer desk to get my phone. I just happened to hear a car door closing right outside the window I was standing next to. I suppose I was being nosy, but my curiosity compelled me to look out to see what was up. I looked out just in time to see a young man I didn't recognize closing my neighbor's car door. My attention was now piqued, and as I continued to watch, I caught sight of another strange young man attempting to open the doors of some other's cars across the parking lot. It was now apparent to me that the two guys were looking for stuff to steal, so I dialed 911 as fast as possible. I gave the dispatcher the lowdown, and she asked if the two dudes were still at my location. When I looked again, I couldn't see them anymore, so without thinking, I told her to hold on, and I ran out my rear sliding door to look for them. I know how stupid this was, but I was trying to be as helpful as I could and acted more on impulse than logical thought. The two of them did finally come back into view, just in time for me to realize how close they actually were. This was when my heart began to pound. I'd been so eager to help, I darn near ran into them face to face. In truth, they were probably a good 25 yards away, but it was the middle of the night, and I was within spitting distance of a pair of criminals. I was truly scared out of my shorts now. I guess I was in some kind of fog because I had forgotten I was still on the phone with 911. The lady had to say hello a couple of times to get my attention. When I did finally answer her, I told her that they were indeed still in the parking lot. However, I left out the part where I ran outside and was now in a very close vicinity to them. Up to this point, they had not noticed my presence, but that would soon change. The bigger looking of the two must have heard me talking. He looked up from the car he was attempting to get info, and we made eye contact with one another. He stayed where he was and watched me for a while. I was still talking to the dispatcher during this time, praying the cops would get there before I was killed. Finally, the big guy began to approach me, and he didn't look pleased. He stopped a few yards away and asked me what I was doing. I was too scared to answer at first, but when he began walking closer, I told him I was talking to the cops. This got his attention. He stopped in his tracks and gave me a skeptical look. This look would quickly disappear when I noticed a cop car entering the complex and pointed to it. He looked back and I heard him curse under his breath. Slowly he slipped away, going in the opposite direction and watching the cops the whole time. An officer eventually noticed me and asked if I was the one who called. I said yes and pointed in the direction the big guy escaped. He thanked me and took off with another car in that direction. The second cop had caught the other guy very quickly. I remember I still had the dispatcher on the phone and thanked her for her help. We hung up and I went back inside my apartment. For the remainder of the night until dawn, I watched out for the big guy to return. Soon after I went back inside my place, it dawned on me that they may come back to get revenge on me for snitching. My lookouts for him continued for several more weeks until things took priority. However, actually I could never feel comfortable or safe until I moved to a new apartment complex, which I eventually did, about a year later. I never heard whether he was picked up by the cops or anything else pertaining to the case whatsoever. From time to time, when I'm thinking back to that night, I wondered if the big guy ever returned to the apartment after I left. For the sake of the new tenant, I pray not. I like to tell myself the police swept him up within minutes of leaving and he's still in jail on other charges, never to be released, but the fact is, he was probably never caught and he's moved on with his life. Hopefully I never cross his mind again. If I end up going missing, you guys will know I didn't. I'd had my eye on this place for a month or two and was hoping for better weather to come around. However, circumstances forced my hand and I had to go in sooner than I planned. The homeowners posted up a for sale sign, and with the market being the way it was at the time, I assumed I didn't have much time before it sold. The house caught my attention in the first place just after Christmas. I happened to be driving by after casing another place and noticed all the boxes stacked up next to their trash cans. Among the best things they'd received was a pair of LED computer monitors and one of those 40-inch LED smart TVs. Mind you, at this time, stuff like this was still fairly expensive. There were also a laptop and PlayStation 3 box in the pile. All this cool new stuff made me jealous. I know I may joke, but leaving out all these boxes is an open invitation to thieves. The best thing to do is break them down and put them inside your garbage cans. The term out of sight, out of mind applies great in this kind of situation. There was a couple of other places on my list before this one, but the day the sign went up, I knew I needed to act fast. So just after lunch, I climbed through a window in the garage and snuck into the house. Most of the afternoon, at least until 3 p.m., was mine to browse. Their comings and goings were very familiar to me by then, and I was confident I had plenty of time to work. Inside of the house, everything was top quality and the air smelled clean and fresh. I can't say I expected anything less. The home itself was modest, but just from their cars, it was clear they were well heeled. I did a cursory glance through the living area before I moved on to the bedrooms. There wasn't much to grab, and I continued on to the first floor. As I opened it, I was smacked in the face by a wall of stench. It could only be feces, but wasn't obvious until I looked down and saw the dog kennels. They must lock their dogs up while they're gone, and the dogs must have crapped in the kennels. I couldn't help but feel bad for the poor beasts. There were better ways to keep your dogs from damaging your home. Then, the size of the kennels struck me. They were massive. I mean Great Dane-sized boxes. I thought about letting them out. I leaned down to talk to one of them. Yes, I talk to dogs, so what? And what I saw shocked me to my core. I put my shirt over my nose and leaned over to see how bad these poor creatures' conditions really were. But instead of a dog, the face that looked back at me was a child's. It appeared to be a girl, and she didn't look to be more than 5 years old. I became furious instantly. I quickly looked over to the other can and was met face to face by another girl that looked identical. I was biting my lips so hard, the taste of blood soon filled my mouth. Why in the effing world were there a pair of twin little girls locked up in boxes, forced to wallow in their own feces? These were normal-looking, beautiful children. No valid reason came to me. I realized I was becoming so wound up, tears had started pouring down my face. I couldn't think of anything other than getting them out of that house. The idea of stealing having long left my thoughts. Right before I opened the first kennel, I stopped myself. Hold it right there, I thought. I was going to have to do this right, or my future, in addition to theirs, would be screwed. It only took a moment before I figured it out. I leaned over and made a promise to them I was going to get them out of their prison, and soon. The terrified sets of blue eyes that looked back at me almost made me change my mind, but I held to my purpose and rapidly slipped out of the house. In spite of the rage I felt coursing through me, I continued on in my car and dialed 911. This was almost opposite to everything I'd ever believed, but it was no longer just about me. When the operator came on, I told her I wanted to stay anonymous, but my son had recently been in the home and saw the cages with the 2 children. He was very upset, as well as myself, and I demanded the cops check it out. She sounded a little skeptical, but she'd pass it on, nonetheless. I wasn't totally sure the cops were going to believe me, so I also called the Crime Stoppers number and told them the same story. I was so furious by now I didn't need to act upset to get my point across. This operator seemed much more interested in what I had to say, but even then, I still had no guarantee that anything would be done. I wasn't going to be able to think of anything else, so I sat a few blocks away and waited, and waited, and waited, and waited. The hours dragged by so slowly, I must have smoked 2 packs of cigarettes in that time. The mother came home a few hours in, and I prayed like never before that the girls wouldn't say anything about my visit. Not too much later, a pair of cop cars pulled up in front of the house. My first thought was that they had said something. However, the longer I thought on it, I realized that there was no way she was going to call the cops over a burglary. She'd be screwed the second she told the story. I knew then that the cops were there to look around. A few more cars and a pair of ambulances showed up soon after, and that was when I was sure that they were safe. I'm not ashamed to say that I cried like a little girl. When the cops brought that rotten woman out in cuffs, I could finally relax and go home. According to the news, both parents were convicted of a whole slew of crimes and sentenced for up to 15 to 30-year stretches. Not long enough as far as I'm concerned, but I was pleased to know those poor girls were far from those awful people. When it comes to the twins, not much is out there. Because of their age, there's no names or information of where they landed. All I can say is that they went into the system. Now, being a product of the system, I can't guarantee their future will be great. Regardless of that, I'm positive it will be better than it was before. Now that my wife and I are no longer together, and I'm sure she'll never see this, I'm eager to share a terrible episode she went through about 4 years into our marriage. I was out of town when this happened, and most of what I know is secondhand. However, I believe you'll still get the feeling of fear she felt while it was happening. For the story, we'll call her Sarah. Sarah left the house that morning like normal people for work. Since it was a Friday, her office closed early and she agreed to go out for drinks with some of the girls. This wasn't something she would normally do, but because I was gone and our daughter was with me, she took the opportunity to go out and have a good time. She let time get away from her and ended up getting a bit more intoxicated than she expected. Dinner was ordered and her next few hours were spent sobering up. Around midnight, she said she was finally confident enough to drive home. Just to be safe, she took her time and drove on the back roads to our house. Just before 1 a.m., she made it home safe and sound. Unfortunately, she wasn't paying attention, and as the garage door closed, 2 men slept in and stuck a gun in her back. From what I know about her, she probably peed herself, but she left that part out of her recollection. These guys didn't seem to be pros at this and would make several mistakes that would come back to hurt them. She said one burglar told the other to get her phone while the other tied her up. Instead of searching for it, the idiot grabbed our house phone that looked similar to one of those old flip phones and put it in his pocket. She did nothing to correct this. Once the guy was satisfied she was tied well, he threw her into a closet and locked her in. Her first thought was that she was going to be killed. They hadn't bothered to put a mask on her, and she figured this was because there was no intent for her to live. She knew her phone was still in her pocket and 911 was her only hope. So for the next few minutes, she fought with ropes until she managed to get one hand free. 911 was quickly dialed and she whispered as quietly as she could to the operator. She stopped once in a while and listened for footsteps and then would go back to the operator. He told her not to talk unless she needed to, but to not hang up. Those next few minutes stretched for what seemed like hours until the operator told her the police were pulling up outside. Her hope was that the cops would get to them before they came for her, and that's just what happened. The shouts of the police filled her with relief, and finally, after the longest 15 minutes of her life, the door opened, and she was greeted by the comforting face of an officer. The burglars were being let out of the house at that same time. Their heads were hanging in shame, and neither had the guts to look at her. After the paramedics checked her out and the police left, she called me. I was freaked out, of course, but I was also very proud of her in such a terrifying predicament. There wasn't a trial, fortunately. The idiots took a plea and became wards of the state for the next 5 years or so. Sarah appeared to be handling things well at first, but when the panic attacks and nightmares started, we had to get her help. As far as I know, she may still be attending counseling. Our marriage would begin to implode after a few years, and although she claimed the incident hadn't changed her, things were truly never the same again. I hope things are better for her now, and her courage serves as an example to our daughter. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.